The air in the villa overlooking Antium was thick with the scent of brine and late-blooming roses, but to the woman giving birth, it held only the metallic tang of struggle. It was December 15th, 37 Common Era. The man who would become the master of the world, the last scion of the Julio-Claudian line through his mother, arrived not with a scream of triumph, but a whimper that sounded desperately fragile against the roaring sea. His mother was Agrippina, the younger, granddaughter of Augustus. His father was Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, a man infamous for his savage temper and a casual disregard for law that bordered on the monstrous. Agrippina was a creature of high intelligence and lethal ambition, currently residing in the treacherous shadow of her brother, the Emperor Caligula, a man whose moods shifted like the unreliable wind off the Tyrrhenian Sea. When the astrologers were consulted about the newborn Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, they did not offer the usual blandishments of a promising future. "He will rule the world," one declared, his aged fingers tracing lines in the dust of the nursery floor. Then his gaze lifted to Agrippina's intense, expectant face, and his voice dropped to a funereal whisper. "But he will be the ruin of his empire and the murderer of his own kin." Agrippina smiled, a cold, sharp expression that seemed to find the price acceptable. "Let him murder anyone," she responded, her voice a promise, "so long as he achieves the throne." Lucius's early years were spent navigating a political topography littered with corpses. Caligula's madness, swift and brutal, resulted in the exile and eventual execution of many, including Agrippina herself, for alleged conspiracies. Lucius was passed between indifferent relatives, a pale, anxious child whose only certainty was his mother's ferocious letters commanding him to remember his lineage. When Caligula was stabbed to death by his own praetorians, the family's fortunes convulsed violently. Claudius, Lucius's stuttering, scholarly, and entirely unexpected great-uncle, was dragged from behind a curtain and declared emperor. Agrippina, recalled from exile, returned to Rome with the force of a tidal wave. She was a woman of singular purpose, and that purpose was centered entirely on her son. Lucius was 7 when his father, Domitius, died of dropsy. The boy inherited a vast fortune. His inheritance meant that he was no longer merely a pawn, he was a valuable prize. Agrippina, utilizing her considerable charm and sharper intellect, began to mold her son's perception of the world. The world, she taught him, was a stage, and trust was a fatal flaw. "Your hands," she told him one afternoon, holding his small, soft palms in hers in the private domus near the Circus Flaminius, "are not meant for handling bronze coins, Lucius. They are meant to hold the scepter, but they must be steady. Power is not granted, it is taken piece by measured piece." She observed the boy critically. He was already showing signs of the Ahenobarbus heritage: red gold hair, a broad forehead, and a tendency toward plumpness that belied his nervous energy. But what interested her most was not his physical appearance, but his peculiar obsession with performance. He preferred the recitation of Greek epics to military drills, and his fingers, already agile, practiced chords on a tiny cithara rather than gripping a wooden sword. "The lyre is fine for idle hours," she conceded, though she hated the softness of his artistic streak. "But the Senate must fear your words more than they admire your poetry." Agrippina's true genius lay in her patience. She was not merely Claudius's niece, she became his final wife. In 49 Common Era, she secured the ultimate prize, marriage to the emperor. Lollia Paulina and other rivals were swiftly eliminated or discredited. The Palatine Hill, once a place of terrifying unpredictability for Lucius, became his home. The Palatine was a labyrinth of marble and ambition. To the boy, the sheer volume of power concentrated there was overwhelming. Senators bowed, legions moved at the nod of Claudius's head, and the massive, clumsy figure of the emperor, often lost in his own administrative details or stupefied by wine, held the ultimate fate of millions. Agrippina's first move was to secure a tutor worthy of a future Caesar. She dismissed the mediocre teachers of his youth and installed Lucius Anarius Seneca, the most brilliant mind in Rome, currently banished to Corsica for alleged adultery with Caligula's sister, Julia Livilla. Seneca arrived in 49 Common Era, sunburned and resentful, yet immediately captivated by the magnitude of his task. He was a master Stoic philosopher, an eloquent playwright, and a political realist. Agrippina ensured he understood the unspoken contract, train Lucius for the purple, and teach him how to wield the power that she would first deliver into his hands. Seneca found Lucius an eager, if melancholic, student. The boy absorbed literature, rhetoric, and Greek philosophy with remarkable ease. Yet beneath the veneer of high culture, Seneca sensed a deep, unbridled spirit, a dangerous combination of sensitivity and theatrical ego. "You read Homer well, my prince," Seneca remarked one afternoon in the schoolroom, Lucius having just finished a dramatic reading of Achilles' Rage. "But do you understand the difference between the rage of a hero on the stage and the controlled fury required of a ruler?" Lucius, now 12, placed the scrolls aside. "Homer teaches us how to move men's hearts, master. A ruler must move more than armies, he must move the emotions of the populace." Seneca raised a skeptical brow. "Emotions are fleeting, Lucius. Law is eternal. You will study the law, and you will understand restraint. The power of Rome rests not in its thunder, but in its measured balance. Learn to deny yourself the satisfaction of applause, and seek instead the quiet approval of the gods and good men." The teachings were high-minded, but the reality of the court was low and visceral. Claudius had a biological son, Britannicus, barely 3 years younger than Lucius, who was the natural heir. Every dinner party, every public appearance, was a silent battle for precedence. Agrippina worked tirelessly. She charmed the Praetorian prefects, Pallas and Burrus. She convinced Claudius to elevate Seneca to the powerful urban praetorship. And finally, she pressed for the essential, irreversible act. In 50 Common Era, Claudius formally adopted Lucius, bestowing upon him the name Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. The change was profound. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus vanished. Nero, the name of destiny, was emblazoned onto the political imagination of Rome. He was now officially the equal of Britannicus, and by virtue of age, the more immediate choice. The adoption ceremony was sombre and carefully orchestrated. Nero, dressed in the toga praetexta of a youthful patrician, felt the weight of Claudius's massive hand on his shoulder. It was the weight of the empire itself. He looked across the atrium and saw Britannicus, small and slight, standing beside his sister Octavia. The boy looked bewildered, his eyes already showing the haunted look of one marked for tragedy. Nero had won the first, crucial battle. He knew, however dimly, that in this brutal family, to achieve victory was simply to survive long enough to face the next conflict. His mother had taught him the melody of ambition, and now the music was about to reach a crescendo. The years between adoption and ascension were characterized by a suffocating tension within the imperial household, a tension that Nero found both stimulating and terrifying. He was tutored by Seneca in the mornings and disciplined by Agrippina in the evenings. The two figures were opposing planets, Seneca urging philosophical moderation and the study of Greek virtue, Agrippina demanding ruthless, immediate political cunning. "The Senate is a hydra, Nero," Agrippina instructed him one day, giving his hand as he signed a minor administrative decree, a practice Claudius allowed to give the boy visibility. "Each head must be placated or severed. Never assume loyalty. Assume self-interest always." His mother's influence was visible everywhere. She had been granted the unprecedented title of Augusta. She appeared on coinage alongside Claudius. At public festivals, she sat on a separate golden chair, an honor previously reserved only for Vestal virgins. Everyone understood. Agrippina was the power behind the throne, and Nero was her instrument. The rivalry with Britannicus was the central axis of his life. Nero was granted the toga virilis, manhood, early at the age of 14, while Britannicus was kept in the shadows, watched constantly by Agrippina's spies. Nero felt a genuine, if fleeting, pity for his stepbrother. Britannicus was an intelligent, reserved boy utterly loyal to his sister Octavia, who was soon to become Nero's obligatory wife. Yet the political machinery demanded that Nero view Britannicus as a rival, a threat to be managed, or ultimately removed. The final decisive moves came in 54 Common Era. Claudius was agging, his health failing, his trust in Agrippina wavering. The emperor had begun to show a renewed interest in Britannicus, perhaps regretting the adoption. Agrippina understood that the window of opportunity was closing. On the night of October 13th, 54 Common Era, Rome held its breath. The details of the deed were obscured by layers of denial and official propaganda, yet the whispers, potent as wine, spread instantly through the city. The famous poisoner Locusta was involved. The imperial taster Helotus was bribed. The victim was the emperor. Nero was kept awake throughout the night by Agrippina, rehearsing his address to the Praetorian Guard. He was 16 years old, dressed in the purple, his face pale and drawn. He felt not triumph, but a staggering terror. When dawn broke, Agrippina stood beside the still, cold body of Claudius. She waited until Britannicus and Octavia were safely confined, and then she dispatched Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, to introduce the new emperor. The Praetorian camp was vast and filled with hardened, skeptical men, many of whom had felt genuine loyalty to the bumbling Claudius. Nero stood before them, Seneca's words echoing in his mind, though the actual speech was heavily edited by Agrippina. He spoke of his grief, of Claudius's divine ascent, and of his own humble duty to accept the burden. Crucially, he spoke of money, a handsome donativum for every man present. The guard cheered, less for the boy than for the gold. The Senate, already assembled, learned of the assassination and the Praetorians' acceptance simultaneously. There was no resistance. Power had shifted. The Republic, for centuries, had become merely a stage where the Julio-Claudian drama unfolded. Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus was emperor. The first acts of the young emperor were greeted with soaring optimism. Seneca, now one of the most powerful men in Rome, advised a return to Augustan principles of restrained rule. Nero's inaugural address, pennied by Seneca, was a masterpiece of political deference. He promised the Senate their ancient dignities and autonomy. He vowed to keep the private affairs of the imperial house out of the public forum. He pledged to rule according to the law, not by whim. Gaius Plinius Sella, a young, ambitious senator present that day, wrote in his private journal, "The boy speaks with the wisdom of Cato and the rhetoric of Cicero. After the terror of Caligula and the confusion of Claudius, we have been given a chance for a golden age. He is young, yes, but he is guided by Seneca and Burrus, men of unimpeachable character." This golden quinquennium, the 5-year period of relatively moderate rule, was a testament to the influence of Seneca and Burrus. Nero, initially thrilled by the power but terrified of its exercise, deferred to them. He established public courts to hear criminal cases, reducing the imperial interference that had plagued Claudius's reign. He worked to lower taxation on the poor, especially in the eastern provinces, showing a remarkable awareness of the suffering of the non-elite. When asked to sign an execution order for a pair of convicted robbers, the 16-year-old emperor reportedly cried out, "I wish I had never learned to write." The people loved his initial humility and his patronage of the arts. He held games that were magnificent, but not cruel, favoring Greek theatrical productions and athletic contests over the savage gladiatorial slaughter preferred by his predecessors. But the real struggle was not in the Senate or the streets, it was within the ivory walls of the Palatine. The mother who had delivered him, the emperor, now expected to control it absolutely. Agrippina behaved as co-ruler. She attended court, standing behind a curtain in the Senate, her voice carrying through the fabric, correcting Seneca's advice or overriding Nero's decisions. She began to hoard power and wealth, alienating crucial allies. Nero, having tasted the heady wine of absolute authority, quickly chafed under this relentless maternal tutelage. He was no longer Lucius, the anxious ward. He was Caesar, the Divi Filius. The conflict became openly visible in 55 Common Era when the Armenian envoys arrived to discuss the continuing tension on the Parthian frontier. As the envoys approached the platform, Agrippina moved to ascend the imperial dais to sit beside her son. Seneca, recognizing the political suicide of displaying shared rule to foreign dignitaries, moved swiftly. He whispered urgently to Nero, "My lord, when she approaches, rise and meet her. That act of filial piety will prevent her from ascending the throne itself." Nero understood instantly. He rose, embracing his mother before the envoys. The message was subtle but devastating. Agrippina was honored, but she remained subject to the emperor's authority. Agrippina's face, when she understood the maneuver, was a mask of cold fury. She knew Seneca had won this round, and she hated him for it. Nero, watching his mother's reaction, felt a strange mixture of exhilarating triumph and chilling fear. He had asserted himself. He was now fully aware that the woman who had risked everything for his power would risk everything again to reclaim it. The mother had become the first enemy. The rift between Nero and Agrippina widened swiftly, lubricated by paranoia and ambition. Agrippina was accustomed to being obeyed. Nero was now accustomed to commanding the world. The ultimate tool of Agrippina's power and Nero's deepest source of vulnerability was Britannicus, the biological son of Claudius. While Nero held the throne, Britannicus held legitimacy. In the winter of 55 Common Era, Britannicus was nearing his 14th birthday, the official age of virilitas in the traditional Roman calendar. Agrippina, sensing Nero slipping away, began to threaten the young emperor by publicly lamenting the injustice done to Claudius's true son. She implied that she might switch her allegiance. Nero's reaction was brutally decisive, a terrible echo of the violent lineage he had tried to ignore. The method was simple: poison, administered at a crowded imperial banquet held on the Palatine. Nero sat at the main table, reclining with his guests, including Britannicus. Since the time of the adoption, Britannicus had been assigned his own tasters, a fact that irritated Nero. The first cup of wine served to Britannicus was too hot. The taster, following protocol, demanded cold water to be mixed in. It was in this cooling water, chilled by snow hauled down from the Apennines, that the fatal, fast-acting dose was slipped. Britannicus drank, choked, and collapsed, his body convulsing in a violent seizure. Panic erupted among the guests. Agrippina, who may have been aware of the plot but not the timing, paled and froze. Octavia, Britannicus's sister and Nero's wife, sat stone-faced, trained since childhood to mask all emotion. Nero, however, was the consummate actor. He leaned back on his couch, his hand waving dismissively. "It is merely one of the young man's epileptic fits," he announced, his voice steady over the rising clamor. "He is afflicted with them since early childhood. It will pass." The casual cruelty of the lie crushed the remaining life out of the room. The guests were forced to continue the dinner, sipping wine, pretending not to see the body being hastily carried out. The murder solved Nero's political problem, but it destroyed his remaining ethical center. Seneca was horrified. He recognized the act as a descent into the madness of his predecessors. When he confronted Nero the next morning, the conversation was icy. "The blood of your brother is on your hands, Caesar," Seneca stated, not accusingly, but with the cold logic of fate. Nero stood at the window, gazing out over the forum. He was no brother, Seneca. He was a pretender, encouraged by a woman who seeks to control me. I secured my throne, that is all. You taught me the inevitability of power. I taught you the restraint necessary for power, Nero. I warned you that to rule by fear is to rule by poison. The people applauded your mercy. They will now whisper of your savagery. Nero turned, his eyes reflecting a glint of the cold Ahenobarbus fury. "The populace loves only what entertains them, master. They will forget Britannicus by the next chariot race. As for Agrippina, her threat is neutralized. She knows now that I will not accept her commands." Seneca realized then that he had created a brilliant orator, but failed to instill a moral governor. The boy was gone, replaced by an emperor who believed that the performance of power was more important than its wise application. In the aftermath of Britannicus's death, Agrippina was thoroughly isolated. Her guards were dismissed, her access to Nero was restricted, and she was forced out of the Palatine and into the nearby Domus Tiberiana. The vacuum left by Agrippina's influence was swiftly filled by new faces, most notably that of Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea was breathtakingly beautiful, a vision of pale skin, blonde hair, and calculated elegance. She was also married to Marcus Salvius Otho, a figure destined for his own brief imperial moment and notorious for her ambition. She appealed directly to Nero's artistic, sensitive nature, celebrating his poetic gifts rather than admonishing his political errors. "Your mother fears your greatness, Caesar," Poppaea would murmur during their clandestine meetings in the gardens of the Servilianum. "She wants a puppet. The world, however, cries out for an artist, a man who can shape the age, not merely manage the bureaucracy." Nero starved of genuine emotional connection. Octavia was a political wife, respectable but frigid, fell instantly and deeply in love. Poppaea's primary demand was consistent and relentless: shed Octavia and eliminate Agrippina. The murder of his mother was not a single, spontaneous act, but a drawn-out, desperate political necessity in Nero's mind. Agrippina, railing from her isolated position, began to cultivate alternative heirs within the Julio-Claudian network, sending dangerous feelers into the Senate. The first attempts were clumsy and veiled. Nero tried to disgrace her legally. When that failed, he attempted to kill her via mundane accidents: a collapsing ceiling, a poisoned meal prepared by a replacement taster. Agrippina, accustomed to a lifetime of court intrigue, evaded them all. Finally, in 59 Common Era, during a festival at Baiae, Nero conceived of a grand theatrical plot, a specially designed ship that would collapse at sea, making the assassination look like an unfortunate maritime disaster. Agrippina was lured onto the vessel. The plot went disastrously wrong. The roof failed to collapse completely, and as the ship began to sink in the Bay of Naples, Agrippina, an agile swimmer, plunged into the water and made it to shore. She sent a freedman back to Nero with a message, assuring him of her safety. Nero's reaction was not relief or shame, but sheer, blinding panic. He had failed, and now his furious mother knew explicitly that he sought her life. He understood that she would move immediately to depose him. He consulted Burrus and Seneca. Burrus, the tough soldier, was horrified and refused to order his praetorians to perform the execution. "I sign no soldier's oath to kill your mother, Caesar," he is reported to have said. Seneca, paralyzed by the moral dilemma, could not stop the momentum. He realized that if Agrippina lived, she might depose Nero, leading to civil war. If she died, Nero would be eternally damned, but the stability of the empire might be secured. In a moment of tragic compromise, Seneca offered no verbal objection. His silence was his eternal shame. Nero turned to the naval prefect, Anicetus, a freedman who held a bitter, long-standing grudge against Agrippina. Anicetus led a contingent of troops to Agrippina's villa near Misenum. They found her alone in her room, attended only by a lamp and a single maid. Agrippina, sensing her moment had finally come, stood tall. The soldiers hesitated. "If you have come to inquire as to my health," she said, her voice clear and cutting, "I can assure you I am well." Anicetus announced the emperor's decree. Agrippina understood. She looked down at the dagger Anicetus held, knotting the soldiers' fear more than her own. Her final, devastating words recorded by historians and instantly seared into Rome's collective memory, were directed at the man poised to strike. "Strike here," she commanded, pointing to her womb. "Strike the vessel that bore such a monster." The blow was final. Nero returned to Rome a parricide. His hands had finally done the bloody work his lineage demanded. The initial reaction was terror. The Senate, convinced Nero had lost his mind, prepared for the worst. But then, an astonishing thing occurred. The Roman populace, particularly the plebeians who had suffered under Agrippina's avarice and arrogance, reacted with unexpected relief. Public celebrations were organized, manipulated by Nero's agents, but genuine nonetheless. Statues of Agrippina were torn down. Nero, still deeply shaken, was astonished by the public acceptance of his heinous crime. He had expected outrage. He received applause. Seneca, recognizing the sheer necessity of damage control, penned a public letter to the Senate justifying the murder, painting Agrippina as a vicious, conspiring tyrant who had threatened the state. It was a masterpiece of legalistic sophistry, but Seneca hated himself for writing it. Nero, observing the ease with which his crime was excused, learned the most dangerous lesson of all. As emperor, he was beyond the reach of human morality. He was an artist, and the lives of those around him were simply material for his grand, terrifying drama. The path to absolute megalomania was now wide open. The years following Agrippina's death, often marked as 60-62 Common Era, represented a shift from necessary evil to enthusiastic excess. Nero, freed from his mother's political maneuvering and Seneca's moral restraints, turned his full obsessive attention to his deepest passion, performance. Rome's elite were horrified. To the conservative Roman mind, public declamation, singing, and performance were the domain of slaves, freedmen, or the lowest classes of entertainers. For a Roman princeps, the embodiment of virtus, pietas, and military might, to engage in such spectacles was an utter disgrace. Nero saw it differently. He believed he was fulfilling the highest potential of his office. He was a poet, a singer, a tragedian. Why should the greatest artist in the world hide his talent? In 60 Common Era, Nero inaugurated the Neronia, a massive cultural festival modeled on the Greek Olympics, focusing on music, oratory, and athletics. The tension was palpable when Nero himself took the stage. He began simply, reciting his own epic poem on the destruction of Troy, his voice clear and unexpectedly powerful. He then moved to the cithara, singing accompanied by the delicate strings. The people loved it. They saw their emperor, a god on earth, performing for them, sweating, struggling for the high notes, asking for their applause. Milo, a street vendor who hawked roasted chestnuts and watered wine near the Circus Maximus, remembered the sensation vividly. Milo's primary concern was survival in the subura, the crowded, fetid downtown district. He disliked the senators, who were stiff and starved of humor. But Nero was one of them, only richer. The first time he sang, Milo would recount years later to his sons, it was strange. The soldiers looked away, ashamed. But he sang a song about a shepherd losing his flock in the rain, and his voice, it was sad. It was real. We cheered because he was singing for us, not for the marble men in the Curia. The official court, however, was miserable. Nero forced senators, even those of consular rank, to attend his performances and compete in the games. Attendance was mandatory, silence during his performances was treasonous, and applause had to be executed with precise, professional vigor. Seneca, increasingly exhausted and disillusioned, tried one last time to guide his pupil. He proposed that Nero perform in the privacy of the palace, for a select audience, or even sponsor a magnificent theater, but remain apart from the stage. "Your talents are vast, Caesar," Seneca pleaded, walking with Nero through the gardens of the Domus Aurea, which was already being planned. But the mantle of the emperor is not merely for display. It requires dignity. It requires men to look at you and see the majesty of Rome, not a mere player. Nero stopped, frowning. He was now 23, and his youthful plumpness had settled into a robust, slightly dissipated physique. "Dignity is a mask for the tedious, master," Nero argued. "The Senate fears me because they cannot control me, not because I sing. They hate that I reach the common man without their intercession. They prefer the dry, dusty rule of laws. I prefer the electric charge of human connection. When I sing, I'm more powerful than when I sign a decree. I transcend the man, I become the myth." Seneca saw the futility. Nero was no longer interested in Stoic philosophy. He was obsessed with pharma, immortality through art. Seneca gradually withdrew from public life, citing ill health and offering Nero the entirety of his vast fortune to be free of obligation. Nero graciously accepted the fortune, but refused the retirement. Seneca remained a gilded prisoner in Rome, a silent symbol of Nero's abandoned promise. The political machinery required constant maintenance, however, and the years 62-63 Common Era saw two crucial, brutal acts: the deaths of Burrus and Octavia. Burrus, the reliable Praetorian prefect and the check against Nero's worst impulses, died of a sudden, violent throat tumor, although many rumors suggested poison engineered by Poppaea. His death removed the last credible voice of sober military council. Nero appointed two new prefects, Fenius Rufus, a traditional soldier, and Ophonius Tigellinus, a ruthless confidant who encouraged Nero's vices and artistic pretensions. Tigellinus was the dark shadow Nero needed. He replaced the idealism of Seneca with the cynicism of unchecked power. With Burrus gone, Octavia's fate was sealed. Poppaea, now openly living as Nero's mistress, demanded the final divorce. Octavia, the daughter of Claudius, was utterly blameless and universally beloved by the people. She was divorced on trumped-up charges of barrenness. The populace rioted in protest, tearing down Poppaea's statues and marching on the palace. Nero was shaken by the intensity of the common people's loyalty to his discarded wife. Poppaea, incensed by the public humiliation, pressed the advantage. She concocted a further horrific accusation, adultery with a freedman named Eucerus. Octavia, exiled and then imprisoned, faced a mock trial. Even under torture, her slaves refused to testify against her, but the political necessity of her death was paramount to Poppaea. Tigellinus arranged for false testimony. Octavia was executed in 62 Common Era. Her head was severed and brought to Poppaea, who reportedly gazed upon it with cool satisfaction. This second murder, the killing of the quiet, pious sister-wife, shocked the elite far more than the parricide. Agrippina was dangerous. Octavia was innocent. Nero was discarding the very foundation of his legitimacy, sacrificing the goodwill of his public life for the sake of his personal obsession. The court was now dominated by sycophants, astrologers, and artists. Nero married Poppaea Sabina 15 days after Octavia's death. The political capital of the quinquennium was spent, replaced by a growing, deep-seated fear. Nero, however, felt truly alive for the first time. For the first time, passion had triumphed over duty. He considered the consequences, the whispers, the Senate's sullen looks, and dismissed them all. "They are merely envious," he mused to Poppaea, holding her hand as they watched the flickering light of the lamplight across the black marble tiles of the dining room. "They are grey creatures trapped in the past. I am building something new. I am creating an age where beauty, not bureaucracy, defines Rome." He loved Poppaea, but he loved the idea of himself, the artistic, revolutionary emperor, even more. He was now 25 years old, absolute master of the known world, and utterly convinced of his own genius. It was this belief, this overreaching ego, that made the catastrophe of 64 Common Era not merely a natural disaster, but a tragedy of imperial hubris. July 18th, 64 Common Era. Rome was sweltering. The height of summer meant dry wood, crowded tenements, and a pervasive smell of sweat and sewage clinging to the lower slopes of the Viminal and Esquiline hills. Nero was not in the city. He was pursuing his artistic passion in the cooler climate of Antium, the coastal town of his birth. The fire started late that evening in the area of the Circus Maximus, specifically in the shops nestled against the Palatine and Caelian hills. These shops were filled with every sort of flammable material: oil, dried beans, linen, paper. Milo the vendor was asleep in his small hot room in the Subura when his wife woke him, screaming, "The air, Milo, the air is cooking!" Milo ran onto the street. Above the roar of the city, a new, terrible sound was rising. A hungry, sustained crackle, punctuated by the structural collapses of timber-framed buildings. The wind, usually a negligible factor in Rome's topography, whipped down the valley between the Palatine and the Caelian, acting as a massive bellows. The flames leaped across the narrow streets like a predator across stepping stones. The fire was not merely burning wood, it was consuming Rome. The Subura, a dense, chaotic maze of 6- and 7-story insulae apartment blocks, was instantly imperiled. The tenants, roused from sleep, fought desperately to save what little they possessed. Milo watched, terrified, as a multi-story insula across the street seemed to sigh, its wooden frame buckling before it dissolved into a roaring column of fire, sending sparks high into the black sky. "The water," Milo shouted, grabbing his buckets, but the city had no effective centralized fire service. Private slave brigades were instantly overwhelmed. The wells ran dry, the fountains became mere trickles. The horror was compounded by the speed of the blaze. It consumed the Circus Maximus, destroying the shops and stands, and then surged up the slopes. It burned for 6 full days and 7 nights without abatement. The air was dense and suffocating. The smell, the overwhelming, nauseating smell of burning cedar, melting wax, scorched flesh, and the acidic runoff of burning wine, was inescapable. In Antium, Nero received the news with a strange mix of shock and artistic inspiration. Here was a drama that eclipsed any tragedy he had ever written. His city, the center of the world, was being consumed. He rode back to Rome immediately. When he arrived, the flames were nearing the gardens of Maecenas, threatening the Esquiline. Nero, dressed simply and accompanied by minimal guards, Tigellinus was already attempting to organize relief, stood on the remaining high ground of the Palatine and witnessed the inferno. It was an unforgettable sight. The city had become a vast, flickering furnace. Pillars of smoke rose so high they obscured the sun, creating an unnatural orange dusk. The screams of the dying, the frantic shouts of the survivors, and the sound of collapsing marble blended into a monolithic noise of despair. Nero watched not as a ruler, but as a spectator. He was horrified, yes, but also mesmerized by the elemental power of the destruction. He immediately began to organize relief efforts, which were genuinely commendable. He opened the Campus Martius and his own gardens to refugees. He secured grain shipments from Ostia and the provinces at below-market prices. He began to organize crews to create fire breaks, tearing down standing structures to deny the fire fuel. Yet, amidst these desperate actions, the seeds of the most damaging rumor were sown. Perhaps it was his pale, theatrical reaction, or the fact that he was seen composing lines of poetry about the tragedy of Troy's destruction while watching Rome burn. The rumor, virulent and fast-spreading, alleged that Nero, standing on a high tower, had put on his theatrical costume, taken up his cithara, and performed his own epic poem on the fall of Troy, comparing the Roman disaster to the ancient Greek myth. He sang, the people whispered in the refugee camps. He played the lyre while our children burned. The association between the artistic emperor, obsessed with spectacle, and the greatest spectacle of destruction the city had ever known, was irreversible. The rumor solidified into a terrible certainty. Nero had started the fire himself. And why? To clear space for his grand, revolutionary architectural designs. The fire raged out of control again after a brief lull, consuming the Via Lata and the Campus Martius, forcing another wave of refugees. By the time the blaze was finally contained, 10 districts out of Rome's 14 were severely damaged. 3 were entirely leveled. Nero was faced with a ruined capital and a populace convinced of his guilt. The people, who had endured his parricide and his divorce without major revolt, would not forgive the destruction of their homes and livelihoods. When the smoke finally cleared enough to assess the damage, Nero saw not ashes but opportunity. He immediately conceived of a vast rebuilding program, one that would make Rome safer, more beautiful, and entirely centered around his imperial vision. He decreed new building codes, wider streets, more required fire breaks, and stone facades instead of timber for the lower stories. Crucially, he seized a vast portion of the newly cleared land that had belonged to the common people, to build a glorious new imperial palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This palace was less a dwelling and more a megalomaniacal park, stretching across the scorched slopes of the Palatine, Esquiline, and Caelian hills. It featured rolling pastures, vineyards, artificial lakes, and a main hall whose ceiling was covered in revolving ivory panels that showered flowers and perfume onto the guests. The centerpiece was a colossal bronze statue of Nero, 100 feet high, depicting him as the sun god Sol Invictus. The cost was astronomical. To finance it, Nero imposed harsh levies across the empire, stripping temples and draining provincial treasuries. The people saw the Domus Aurea rising from the ruins of their homes and confirmed their worst suspicions. The fire, they concluded, was not started by accident, but by the emperor's conscious, artistic, and utterly selfish desire for a blank canvas. Backlash became a tidal wave of hatred. The whispers coalesced into open, dangerous talk. Nero, desperate and afraid, needed a counter-narrative. He needed a scapegoat. Tigellinus, ever the pragmatist of cruelty, provided the solution: blame the Christians. This small, obscure sect of monotheists, followers of an executed Galilean preacher, were numerous in the Subura, but hated by the mainstream Roman public for their rigid refusal to worship the Roman gods or the emperor's genius. They were considered practitioners of a pernicious superstition and haters of the human race. The persecution began swiftly. Livia, a former slave woman who had found deep spiritual solace in the Christian community near the Ostian Gate, was arrested in the sweeps. She was dragged before the Praetorian guards, her face marked by soot and exhaustion. "Did you light the flame?" the inquisitor demanded. Livia, though terrified, stood firm. "We do not worship fire, Tribune. We worship the light of the world. We are not arsonists. You speak of the end times, of the destruction of the world by fire." The Tribune sneered, citing common but misunderstood Christian tenets. "You called for this disaster." Livia was sentenced to death in the public spectacles held in the imperial gardens, designed for the entertainment of the populace. The executions were not quick or merciful, they were theatrical. Christians were sewn into animal hides and thrown to dogs. Others were crucified. Nero, ever the director of spectacle, came up with the grandest, most horrific idea: living torches. Livia and dozens of others were covered in pitch, nailed to posts, and lined up along the length of Nero's newly built gardens in the Palatine precinct. As dusk fell, they were ignited, providing macabre lighting for the chariot races and dinner parties of the emperor. The smoke from the pyres mingled with the oil and perfume of the Palatine feasts. Nero, reclining at his banquet table under the shade of the newly erected columns, reportedly found the light beautiful, even haunting. But even the cruel Roman populace, hardened by years of gladiatorial slaughter, were repulsed by the sheer novelty of these tortures. They understood savage justice, but this felt like artful, unnecessary sadism. Tacitus, the historian, would later write that even pity began to arise for these people, whom Nero sacrificed, not for the common good, but to glut his own savage cruelty. The scapegoating had failed. Nero's hands were now covered not just in the blood of his family, but in the guilt of untold innocence. He had bought himself time, but at the cost of his soul and the fragile loyalty of the Roman people. The period following the fire and the persecutions, 65-67 Common Era, was an era of profound paranoia and crystallized tyranny, dominated by the construction of the Domus Aurea. Nero was no longer content merely to reign. He demanded to be adored. He withdrew into the increasingly elaborate world of the palace, surrounded by people who confirmed his every belief, especially his belief that he was the greatest poet ruler in history. The building process for the Golden House was ruthless, overseen by the architects Severus and Sella, who indulged Nero's most fantastical demands. Tax revenues poured in from the provinces only to be immediately spent on frescoes, precious stone veneers, and the enormous revolving dining room, the Coenatio Rotunda, hailed as a marvel of engineering. Meanwhile, the Senate and the old Roman aristocracy stewed in silent revolt. They were forced to watch Nero descend from princeps to histrio actor, performing openly in Rome and even driving a chariot in the circus. Every senator felt the sting of humiliation. This atmosphere of bitter resentment inevitably led to conspiracy. In 65 Common Era, a vast, intricate plot materialized, spanning the highest echelons of Roman society, the Pisonian conspiracy. The nominal leader was Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a popular and distinguished senator, handsome and eloquent, who promised a return to senatorial dignity and order. The plot included senators, knights, military tribunes, and even Seneca's nephew, the poet Lucan. The plan was to assassinate Nero during the games in the Circus Maximus and proclaim Piso emperor. The conspiracy was immense, perhaps involving hundreds, and its sheer size was its undoing. A freedman named Epaphroditus, close to one of the conspirators, panicked and informed Tigellinus. Tigellinus, the cynical praetorian prefect, was a master of extraction. The investigation that followed became a terrifying purge that eclipsed the worst days of Claudius. Torture was applied liberally, names were broken out of the conspirators, and the net widened daily. The Senate was paralyzed. Senator Plinius Sella, the man who had cheered Nero's inaugural speech, now lived in constant dread, sleeping with a short dagger under his pillow. He watched as his oldest friends were dragged away. "We live in the age of whispering," Plinius wrote in the secrecy of his underground writing chamber. "To speak openly is to invite death. To be silent is to be complicit. We are trapped in a gilded cage built by a madman who sees the world only as a backdrop for his next poem." Piso was clumsy, perhaps, but his failure has revealed the true depth of Nero's cruelty. We are not men, we are extras awaiting our scene of execution. The fallout destroyed the remnants of the old court. Seneca was implicated, though it is unclear how deeply. Nero, perhaps viewing his former mentor as a symbol of the restraint he had rejected, seized the opportunity. Seneca was ordered to commit suicide. The old philosopher met his end with characteristic calm. He spoke to his friends for hours, dictating final philosophical reflections before slitting his wrists in the Roman style. His blood flowed too slowly in his aged body, so he was placed in a hot bath, where he finally succumbed to the vapors. The symbol of the golden quinquennium was erased. Lucan, the brilliant young poet, was also forced to die. In a final act of literary defiance, he cited his own verses from Pharsalia, a poem about the civil war between Caesar and Pompey, as he bled to death. Petronius, the arbiter of elegance, the man who had supposedly guided Nero's theatrical taste, was also implicated. Petronius did not rush his death. He dined, wrote letters mocking Nero's performing skills, and then, in a gesture of profound decadence, commanded his own doctor to open and bandage his veins repeatedly, allowing him to bleed out slowly while listening to music and discussing light poetry. He sent Nero a final scroll listing the emperor's sexual exploits and demanding an official critique of his latest, atrocious verses. The purge eliminated the last voices of dissent, dignity, and criticism. Nero was now surrounded only by Tigellinus and his entourage of debauched flatterers. Poppaea, who had been elevated to the rank of Augusta, provided Nero with his only legitimate child, Claudia Augusta, who died as an infant. This brief period of family stability ended violently in 66 Common Era. Poppaea, pregnant again, dared to criticize Nero's late return from a chariot race. In a fit of drunken rage fueled by his artistic temperament, Nero kicked her violently in the stomach. Poppaea died soon after of a hemorrhage. Nero was devastated. He had loved Poppaea, but he loved his rage more. Unable to process the guilt, he staged a magnificent state funeral, deified her, and searched desperately for a replacement who could capture her exotic beauty. He found it in Sporus, a young freedman who bore a striking resemblance to Poppaea. Nero ordered Sporus to be castrated and then publicly married him, treating him as his empress. This act, the marriage to a castrated male dressed in imperial female finery, was the final insult to Roman sensibility. The Senate found it easier to accept parricide than this grotesque violation of gender and social norms. Nero, realizing Rome was becoming too hostile, too judgmental of his art, decided to seek the adulation he craved elsewhere. In 67 Common Era, Nero departed for Greece. He spent over a year touring the Greek cities, competing in every major athletic and poetic contest. He forced the organizers of the venerable Olympic Games to delay the festival by a year so he could attend. He drove chariots of 10 horses, an impossibly difficult feat, performed his poems and played his cithara. He never lost. When he fumbled a reading or fell from his chariot, no one dared to mark him down. The judges, terrified of his power, declared him the winner of all 1,800 events he entered. Nero was euphoric. This was the true Rome, the cradle of culture, the people who appreciated true genius. In a grand gesture of gratitude, Nero declared Greece liberated, freeing them from economic burden and Roman colonial taxation. It was a financially irresponsible act of artistic self-indulgence. When he returned to Rome in 68 Common Era, he entered the city not in the robes of a returning general, but in a victor's chariot, wearing a Greek athlete's purple cloak, crowned with olive leaves. The walls of Rome were torn down in places, so the victor could enter the city of his triumphs without passing through a common gate. He had achieved true artistic success, but he had spent the empire's fortune and shattered the last vestiges of military loyalty. The legions, watching their emperor prance on stage while the frontiers grew restless, were losing patience. The exhaustion of the empire's resources for the Domus Aurea and the Greek tour coincided with a rise in genuine military unease along the borders, notably in Judea and Britannia. The provinces had been stripped bare, and the governors were furious. The first tremor of revolt came from Gaul. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, a Romanized Gaul, raised the standard of rebellion in 68 Common Era. He declared his intention to restore senatorial liberty, but he did not claim the throne for himself. Instead, he appealed to the distinguished, aged governor of Hispania Tarraconensis, Servius Sulpicius Galba, to lead the movement. Galba, conservative and deeply loyal to the old traditions, hesitated. But when Nero declared Vindex a public enemy and sought his immediate execution, Galba understood he was implicated. He declared his loyalty to the Senate and the Roman people and raised his legions. Nero, upon hearing the news, reacted with astonishing levity. "Vindex wishes to see me step down," he exclaimed to Tigellinus, who was already mobilizing the guard. "But how can he? I'm merely preparing the score for my new opera. He knows nothing of music." His primary concern was not the loss of Gaul, but the destruction of his rare musical instruments, which Vindex had allegedly seized. He wrote letters to the Senate urging them to consider the loss of his art, not the loss of the province. The Senate, seeing their chance, moved with the stealth they had lacked during the Pisonian conspiracy. They condemned Vindex, but their condemnations were weak. Meanwhile, they began to rally around Galba. The initial loyal response came from the legions of the Rhine, who crushed Vindex's rebellion swiftly. Vindex committed suicide. Nero rejoiced, believing the immediate threat was over, but Galba, though weakened, still held Hispania. The crucial turning point came in Rome itself. Nero had ruled for 13 years, leaning wholly on the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard, whose prefect, Tigellinus, had been his partner in crime. But Tigellinus was a political animal. He sensed the impending disaster. The coffers were empty, and the promise of the usual donativum, the massive bonus required to purchase the loyalty of the Guard upon a transfer of power, could not be met. Galba, conversely, was promising immense wealth. The betrayal was swift and total. Aelius Nymphidius Sabinus, a commander in the Praetorian Guard, seeing Tigellinus waver, made his move. He convinced the Praetorians that Nero had fled and that Galba was already in Rome. He promised them a massive 30,000 sesterces per man, nearly 10 times the amount Claudius had paid. The Praetorians, motivated by raw greed, abandoned Nero upon the spot. Nero, asleep in his newly finished section of the Domus Aurea, woke to find his servants fleeing, his officers gone, and a terrifying silence where the usual bustle of the imperial guards should have been. He ran through the vast, echoing halls of the Golden House, calling out for his men, his wives, his guards. No one answered. He grabbed a dagger, rushed to the Tiber, intending to drown himself, but the water was too shallow. He paused, his artistic ego prevailing even in the face of despair. "No," he muttered, "it is not the time." He searched for a gladiator to execute him honorably, but they too had fled. The genius of the world could not find a single hand willing to kill him. He realized the Senate would declare him a public enemy, a hostis, meaning he could be beaten to death with rods, an utter humiliation for a Caesar. Accompanied only by a handful of loyal freedmen, Phaon, Epaphroditus, and his secretary, Epaphroditus, Nero fled Rome in the last, desperate hours of the night. They rode horses disguised in dirty cloaks, avoiding the main roads, terrified of being recognized. As they passed the Praetorian camp, they heard the shouts of the soldiers proclaiming Galba as emperor. By dawn, they reached the small, humble villa of Phaon, 4 miles north of the city. The villa was a stark contrast to the marble opulence of the Palatine, dusty, sparsely furnished, and quiet. Nero refused to enter through the front gate, crawling on his hands and knees through a dense thicket of reeds and thorns to enter back chamber. He was famished and terrified. The freedmen found him stale bread and water from a ditch, a king reduced to begging for scraps. Nero began to dig his own grave in the dirt floor, sobbing as he worked. He lamented not his crimes, but the impending destruction of his art. He rehearsed lines of poetry about his fate, turning his own demise into a tragic opera. "What an artist dies in me," he cried repeatedly. "Qualis artifex perio." He received a rider who had been dispatched from Rome with urgent news. The Senate, in a single, unanimous decree, had declared Nero a hostis and sentenced him to death by scourging. The sound of horses approaching the villa forced his hand. The hunters, not the Senate's men, but a centurion and a few loyalists of Galba were closing in. Nero hesitated, still unable to commit the final act. "The time has come," he whispered to Epaphroditus. "It is the final verse." He raised the dagger toward his throat. The centurion burst into the hut. "Halt!" The centurion cried, seeing the emperor preparing his own end. Nero, startled by the intrusion and the centurion's sharp voice, plunged the dagger into his own neck, assisted by the desperate hand of Epaphroditus. The final words were choked out, mingling with the spurt of blood. "Too late. This is fidelity." Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, the last true Caesar of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, was dead. He was 30 years old. His reign had begun with the murder of his stepbrother and ended in the murder of himself. He had burned the heart of his capital, destroyed his own family, and alienated his people, all in pursuit of a dream of aesthetic brilliance that only he truly understood. The fire that had lit Rome had finally consumed the artist who had claimed to wield the flame. The Golden House would stand incomplete, a monument to a terrifying hubris. Rome turned its attention instantly to the next pretender, eager for the return of order, completely unaware that the vacuum left by the fallen dynasty would plunge the world into the bloody, chaotic year of the 4 emperors. The age of the artist on the throne was over. The age of the soldier had begun. The silence that followed Nero's death was not peaceful. It was the hollow, echoing quiet of a stage after the final actor has collapsed, and the audience has forgotten whether to applaud or flee. Rome, exhausted by 13 years of theatrical tyranny, did not mourn. Instead, it held its breath, waiting to see who would step into the blood-stained spotlight. The Senate, trembling with newfound courage, met before the sun had fully risen on the day of Nero's suicide. They declared him a public enemy posthumously, erased his name from public inscriptions, and voted to demolish the Domus Aurea stone by golden stone. Yet even as they spoke of liberty and the restoration of the Republic, their eyes darted toward the provinces, where legions were already choosing their own Caesars. The first to move was Servius Sulpicius Galba, the grizzled governor of Hispania, whose rebellion had begun as a protest against Nero's fiscal madness, but now carried the weight of imperial destiny. He was 73 years old, stern and utterly devoid of charm, a man who believed that virtue was its own reward and that soldiers should be paid in discipline, not gold. When news reached him that Nero was dead and the Senate had hailed him as emperor, Galba did not celebrate. He tightened his belt, dismissed the flatterers who had gathered at his camp, and began the long, cautious march toward Rome. But the legions that had once cheered his name now grumbled in their tents. They had been promised 30,000 sesterces each by Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious praetorian who had betrayed Nero. Galba, upon hearing of this reckless pledge, declared it void. "I recruit soldiers," he announced coldly, "not buy them." That single sentence sowed the seeds of his doom. In Rome, the streets were thick with rumor. Some claimed Nero had not died at all, that he had fled east to Parthia, where kings would shelter him until he returned with an army of barbarians to reclaim his throne. Others whispered that he walked among them still, disguised as a beggar, composing dirges for his lost golden house. These stories spread not from loyalty, but from a deep, unspoken fear that the chaos of the moment was not an end, but a prelude. The Praetorian Guard, humiliated by their own betrayal and denied their promised reward, grew restless. They had made an emperor once. They could unmake him just as easily. Into this vacuum stepped Otho, the smooth-tongued former husband of Poppaea Sabina and once one of Nero's closest companions. Otho had charm where Galba had austerity, generosity where Galba had principle. He moved quietly through the barracks of the guard, reminding them of the gold Nero had lavished upon them, and hinting that he too understood the value of loyalty, especially when it was well compensated. On January 15th, 69 Common Era, as Galba attempted to address the people in the forum, the Praetorians turned on him. The old emperor, betrayed and abandoned, was dragged from his litter and butchered in the street. His head was paraded through the city on a spear, his body left to rot until a single freedman, moved by pity, covered it with a threadbare cloak. Otho, now emperor, tried to present himself as a restorer of order. He sent messengers to the legions of the Rhine, promising peace and payment. But the Rhine legions had already chosen their own champion, Aulus Vitellius, a corpulent, indolent general whose only claim to greatness was his father's service under Augustus. Vitellius cared nothing for poetry or philosophy. He cared for feasts, flattery, and the blind obedience of his men. His army, hardened by years on the German frontier, began its march on Rome, not for justice, but for plunder. Otho, to his credit, did not flee. He gathered what forces he could, Praetorians, urban cohorts, and a few loyal legions, and met Vitellius's army at Bedriacum in northern Italy. The battle was short, brutal, and decisive. Otho's troops, outnumbered and outmatched, broke within hours. Rather than prolong the civil war, Otho chose death. He wrote letters to his friends, settled his debts, and then with quiet dignity fell upon his sword. His last words were simple: "I free myself, and I spare Rome further bloodshed." For a moment, the empire seemed to pause, but Vitellius, entering Rome in a chariot drawn by elephants, brought not peace, but gluttony and arrogance. He installed his cooks and jesters in positions of power, emptied the treasury on banquets that lasted for days, and mocked the Senate as a gathering of old women in togas. Yet even as he feasted, another threat was rising in the east. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, a grizzled general of humble birth, had been sent by Nero to quell the Jewish revolt in Judea. There, among the ruins of Jerusalem's outer walls, Vespasian received word of the chaos in Rome. His soldiers, weary of distant wars and hungry for stability, hailed him as emperor. Unlike Galba, Otho, or Vitellius, Vespasian was a pragmatist. He did not speak of virtue or art. He spoke of grain, roads, and taxes. He understood that an empire could not be ruled by poetry or feasts, but by bread and order. His legions, battle-hardened and disciplined, began their march westward. Vitellius, bloated and complacent, underestimated the threat until it was too late. When Vespasian's forces reached Rome, the city burned again, not from accident or artistic vision, but from the fires of civil war. The Capitol, sacred heart of Roman religion, was set ablaze during the fighting, its ancient temples reduced to ash. Vitellius was dragged from a hiding place beneath a palace staircase, mocked by the mob, and executed in the forum where Galba had died. His body was thrown into the Tiber, unburied and unmourned. Vespasian, now sole ruler, did not return to Rome immediately. He remained in the east, securing the provinces, restoring finances, and quietly dismantling the last remnants of Nero's legacy. When he finally entered the city, it was not in a chariot of victory, but on foot, as if to say that the age of spectacle was over. He rebuilt the Capitol, repaired the aqueducts, and began construction of a new amphitheater, the Flavian Amphitheater, later known as the Colosseum, on the very grounds where Nero's artificial lake had once reflected the golden ceilings of his private paradise. In this way, Vespasian did not erase Nero. He buried him beneath stone and public utility. The people, weary of artists and actors on the throne, welcomed a man who measured greatness not in verses, but in bread. And so the fire that had lit Rome under Nero's reign was finally extinguished, not by water, but by the cold, steady hand of necessity. The dream of the artist emperor died in a ditch outside the city walls, but the empire endured, scarred, sobered, and stripped of its illusions. The stage was empty at last, and the real work of governance could begin. The age of the artist on the throne was over. The age of the soldier had begun. Vespasian, son of a tax collector from Rete, did not arrive in Rome with poets at his side or liars in his train, but with engineers, accountants, and legions hardened in the deserts of Judea. He entered the city not through a triumphal arch torn down for theatrical effect, but through the old gates, on foot, his boots dusty from the Appian Way. The people watched him pass in silence, not the silence of awe, but of exhaustion. They had seen gods made of flesh and undone by vanity. Now they welcomed a man who smelled of sweat and soil, who spoke plainly and paid his debts. He found Rome a city of ghosts. The ashes of the great fire still lingered in the cracks of the Forum. The Domus Aurea stood half-finished, its golden halls echoing with the memory of a madman's dreams. Vespasian did not order it razed in fury, he simply repurposed it. The artificial lake was drained, the vineyards uprooted, and on that very ground he laid the foundation for an amphitheater, not for private indulgence, but for the people. Stone by stone, bread by bread, he rebuilt not just walls but trust. The Senate, once a stage for whispered conspiracies and grand betrayals, was allowed to sit again in dignity, not because Vespasian loved them, but because he understood that stability required the illusion of continuity. He pardoned many who had served Nero, so long as they pledged loyalty to the new order. Even Epaphroditus, the freedman who had held Nero's hand as the dagger fell, was spared, until years later, when Vespasian's son Titus, more sensitive to the stain of regicide, ordered his execution. Justice, in the end, was not swift, but it was thorough. In the Subura, Milo the chestnut vendor lived to see his grandchildren play in the shadow of the rising Colosseum. He no longer spoke of emperors as gods or monsters, but as men flawed, mortal, and bound by the same hunger and fear as himself. The games returned, but they were no longer spectacles of imperial ego. They were bread and circuses for a weary populace, a contract between ruler and ruled, order in exchange for distraction. And though the poets ceased to sing of golden ages, the farmers sowed their fields without fear of sudden conscription. The merchants traded without arbitrary levies. The aqueducts flowed clean and full. It was not glorious, this new peace. It had no lyre, no epic verse, no divine light cast upon a single suffering genius, but it endured. Nero's name was erased from inscriptions, his statues toppled or recarved into the likenesses of his successors. Yet in the quiet corners of taverns and tenements, the old stories persisted. Some claimed he had not died at all, but sailed east to Parthia, where kings kept him in silk and song, waiting for the day Rome would call him back. Others swore they heard his voice in the wind that swept through the ruins of the Palatine, a mournful cithara note, fading into silence. But the empire no longer listened. It had learned, through fire and blood and the ruin of a brilliant, broken man, that a throne cannot be held by art alone. Power, it turned out, was not a performance. It was a burden, and only those willing to carry it without fanfare would last. So the curtain fell not with a final chord, but with the quiet turning of a ledger, the laying of a brick, the first harvest after a long winter. The world moved on, and Rome, ever pragmatic, buried its dreams beneath stone and built anew.